things were brought up into Europe. Look at our day. We take our day for granted. The 24-hour day is African. The second of time is African. The second of arc is African. Many of our volumes and weights and measures. And you look at the year, 365 and a quarter day year. That was not for granted. There's no street. To get that, you'd have to have accurate mathematics.
Problem 24 in the Rhine Papyrus, by which the problem is solved by means of an unknown quantity, aha. This is the earliest example of algebraic procedure. Right, did we know then that black people invented algebra? There's the proof. And therefore, if people knew their history, if people knew that their history was relevant, then they wouldn't want to be trying to aspire to be somebody else.
This is the title page from the Rind Mathematical Papyrus. Unfortunately, it's on its side, so you almost have to turn over like that to see it. I apologize. Nonetheless, mathematics did not begin with the Greeks, even the Greeks say so. Geometry was an African invention. And Pythagoras admitted as much. And so did everybody who came after him. This is the Rind Mathematical Papyrus that is 4,000 years old. This is the title page. I'm just going to read you the translation of the title page. The entrance into the knowledge of all existing things and obscure secrets. Interesting title page for a mathematical treatise. One is the Moscow Mathematical Papyrus, showing you the area of a rectangle, or the formula for obtaining the area of a rectangle, A equals L times B. This is what you call, this is problem number 14 of the Moscow Papyrus. This is the formula for finding the volume of a truncated pyramid. Now the volume for a truncated pyramid gives you volume equals height, 1/3 the height, times a squared, ab plus b squared. This is actually more difficult than finding the volume of the total pyramid. Among these ancient people of the Nile, these ancient black peoples of the Nile, we find the first evidence of algebra, because in the Rind Mathematical Papyruses, number 24 to 27, are algebraic equations of the first degree. They also handled algebraic equations of the second degree. Algebra is basically, if you have to strip it down to its essentials, its ability to solve problems when you have an unknown. Now we call that unknown usually X or Y. The ancient Kamites used to call it a quantity. The Great Pyramid, we're only going to say a little bit about the Great Pyramid. Certainly the grandest edifice of its kind ever created by the hand of man. Just want to say I just want to point out two things about the Great Pyramid. 483 feet in height. The base of the pyramid is 13 acres in area. It was built out of 2.8 million, 2.7 million blocks of stone. The lightest stone was 1 ton. The heaviest was 7 tons. Planed to such a smoothness that when they were fitted together, if you plucked the hair out of your head, you could not fit it between the joints. Oriented precisely to the 4 cardinal points. The descending passage was built at 3 degrees 43 minutes in slope, oriented exactly to Alpha Draconis, which shone down at 3340 BC, 3340 BC, and it won't shine it down again until 26,000 years later. The height of the pyramid, if you multiply it by 1 billion, gives you the mean distance between Earth and Sun. People say that's a coincidence. Well, make it happen. That just happens to be the way it is. And the Greeks themselves say so, not once, not twice, but at least a dozen times. All the Greek mathematicians studied in Egypt. Eudoxus, Archimedes, Hipparchus, Pythagoras, Thales, Plato. In fact, the Greeks were in a habit, if they didn't study in Egypt, they would say they would in order to give themselves credibility. This is the interior of the Grand Gallery, showing how it would have been used to measure the time of movement of the stars across this particular area. And it would have therefore given them some way of measuring the minute of arc. This was found. This was found nearly 2,400 years ago in Alexandria, in Egypt. People for a long time, it's dated that time. It was found 100 years ago. People thought it was a bird for a long time until a NASA engineer says, well, look, no bird has that kind of a body. No bird has reverse dihedral wings, and what you can't see is no bird has a vertical tail. He says what this was 2,400 years ago is a glider, an aerodynamically sound glider. Now, don't come out of here and say Dr. Finch says that the Egyptians invented powered flight, that they beat the Wright brothers by 2,400 years. And I'm not saying that, but they were experimenting with aeronautics 2,400 years ago. As I am fond of saying, to quote Solomon, there's nothing new under the sun. And if anyone had put to him or asked him who is the father of medicine, he would have echoed his countryman Homer, who 500 years earlier said that in medicine, Egypt leaves the rest of the world behind.
Again, it's really important to keep chronology together. Mm-hmm. The first Greek that we have on record is Homer, and that's approximately 850 BC, if there was such a person. Many literary critics suggest that there were many people, mm-hmm. and their writings were collected together and then given the name Homer. But be that as it may, at that point, Greek people were not actively involved in the educational system as far as going to school in Africa. But starting around the time of Thales, which would be in the 5th century BC, Thales went to school. We have records of the Greeks themselves. These things are in standard history, so what I'm saying is not a mystery. Thales went to school, came back, advised Pythagoras to go to school. Pythagoras went to school in Africa, was taught for 22 years in Africa. We know the subjects that he taught, that he studied. We know the location where he went to school. We know the name of his major professor. Following Pythagoras, other pre-Socratic Greek philosophers began to go to Egypt for their education. Plato went to school for 12 years in Egypt. Aristotle moved his school when Alexander the Great, his pupil, conquered Egypt. He moved his whole school to Egypt in order to be closer to the source of Egyptian knowledge. In fact, the habit by Greeks of going to school in Egypt was so ingrained, and they valued it so much, that they say that even people who had not gone to Egypt to study would make up biographies to pretend that they had gone, because you had very little legitimacy if you hadn't actually gone to what at that point was the center of higher education in the world.
These people that the Greeks talked about.
But nobody told me that when I was
this
going to
is,
school.
Well, you're looking at Great Memnon, and so I'm telling you this so that if you go back to school,
this is Memnon.
You can carry to those who would teach our children the kind of information that they need to have. This would be Agamemnon, Great Memnon. When, in fact, there are two statues that are misnamed Memnon in the Valley of the Kings, because when the Greeks first got over there, they thought they finally had found the home of Memnon. They just saw two giant statues, and turned out it wasn't Memnon at all. It was one of Amenhotep the third. But
so his African name was
Amen-Amet.
Okay.
God Amen comes forth.
Okay.
Notice he looks almost like he's got dreadlocks on here, the braids. That was very prominent in the ancient committee. Now, let me go back to the chart again, because this is also very important.
Okay.
We now have skipped from this period to this period. In other words, we've left the second golden age, the Middle Kingdom, and we now go to the third golden age. Golden Age 1, Old Kingdom, 2, Middle Kingdom, Golden Age 3. Now let's take a look at some of the things going on in that golden age. Okay, we have this university. This is a scale model of the University of Ipet-Isut, which is the oldest university system in human history. This system, at one point in the 18th dynastic period, which would be around 1500 to 1300 BC, enrolled almost 80,000 students.
For the man who went into the system of education, which you call the mystery system, from age 7, at the time when he was circumcised and brought in. At age 47, 40 years of training, studying the 7 liberal arts, science, law, engineering, all that goes with it, and he had qualified in each of his degrees, he became known as a priest. So that means that you will spend 4 years for your bachelor's, 2 years for your master's, and another 2 or 1 depending for your doctorate. You would have just begun to study. And you're talking about a long time of study. You would have been there 40 years without ever going to see your parents or anyone else.
He said that he became more alert and more human being. He became more, you see, Malone became a more human being. Not just human being, you became a more yourself. You achieve your destiny when you go to Kemet school. You became a human being, more human. We are a human being already, but more human being. That means more wise. And when you go to Kemet school, when Plato himself compared what they do in Kemet school, I give Greek because it will be no debate. You see, it's our school in Greece, the way we are doing things is just for creatures like pigs. You see, like pigs. You see, and he said, myself, I'm ashamed. Myself as a Plato, I'm ashamed. We do things like that, is a shame. And also, not only for myself, as a whole, for all Greek, the Greek world is a shame. What we can do, our education, when you compare with Kemet, is not even for human beings, it's just for pigs, for animals.
In the 18th century, they found that Africans were using both anesthetics and antiseptics in their operating theaters at that time, when in Europe, Listed only introduced antiseptics 2 years earlier than the witness of this operation, which the witness said must have been going on for quite a while because the Africans were performing with routine skill what was then experimental surgery in Europe. In the 13th century, they were performing eye cataract surgery in Jenny. But when we learn about African medicine, they go to the quacks because it's exotic and primitive and nice. It pointed out that Volosimo, one of their scientists, had found perfectly ground spherical crystal lenses in ancient Africa, and that the Africans had telescopes. But it always seems, because we stand at the end, broken and defeated, that we were the last to come on the ladder. No, sir. It's just the opposite. They pioneered in several operations. They pioneered in the cesarean operation. Dr. Finch has written a fine thing on the cesarean. At the time when that operation was experimental in Europe, people like Dr. Felkin went into Africa and observed the Banyoro surgeons performing the cesarean, and the mother was hale and hearty after 4 or 5 days. No woman survived the cesarean in Europe in the 1870s, none. This had found perfectly ground spherical crystal lenses in ancient Africa, and that the Africans had telescopes. But they didn't even bother to think that Africans had telescopes. They said that perhaps, and this is Carl Sagan on big television in America, that some scientifically literate European wandered among the Dogon and gave the African savages this knowledge. They were using tetracycline 14 centuries ago in Nubia. They found the yellow-green flash of tetracycline in Nubian bones. 14 centuries ago. They only started using that antibiotic in America in the 1950s.
This is the interior of the Grand Gallery, showing how it would have been used to measure the time of movement of the stars across this particular area. This was found. This was found nearly 2,400 years ago in Alexandria in Egypt. People for a long time, it's dated that time. It was found 100 years ago. People thought it was a bird for a long time until a NASA engineer says, well, look, no bird has that kind of a body. No bird has reverse dihedral wings, and what you can't see is no bird has a vertical tail. He says what this was 2,400 years ago is a glider, an aerodynamically sound glider. Now, don't come out of here and say Dr. Finch says that the Egyptians invented powered flight, that they beat the Wright brothers by 2,400 years. And I'm not saying that, but they were experimenting with aeronautics 2,400 years ago. As I am fond of saying, to quote Solomon, there's nothing new under the sun, or the Finch corollary is, the only thing that's new is that which has been forgotten. It didn't just happen in ancient Egypt, even after Egypt had left the historical scene. This is a iron smelter from Tanzania, going back 2,000 years, able to achieve temperatures of over 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Temperatures not possible in Europe even 100 years ago. No reason to doubt that whatsoever. He was so great as a physician that a school grew up around him. However, he did not even write a fraction of the so-called Hippocratic written corpus. He did not even compose the Hippocratic Oath. If anyone had put to him or asked him who is the father of medicine, he would have echoed his countryman Homer, who 500 years earlier said that in medicine, Egypt leaves the rest of the world behind.
The Agamemnon, great Memnon. When, in fact, there are two statues that are misnamed Memnon in the Valley of the Kings, because when the Greeks first got over there, they thought they finally had found the home of Memnon. They just saw two giant statues, and turned out it wasn't Memnon at all. It was one of Amenhotep the third. Okay. But
so his African name was
Amen-Amet.
Okay.
God Amen comes forth.
Okay.
Notice he looks almost like he's got dreadlocks on here, the braids. That was very prominent in the ancient committee. Now, let me go back to the chart again, because this is also very important.
Okay.
We now have skipped from this period to this period. In other words, we've left the second golden age, the Middle Kingdom, and we now go to the third golden age. Golden Age 1, Old Kingdom, 2, Middle Kingdom, Golden Age 3. Now let's take a look at some of the things going on in that golden age. Okay, we have this university. This is a scale model of the University of Ipet-Isut, which is the oldest university system in human history. This system, at one point in the 18th dynastic period, which would be around 1500 to 1300 BC, enrolled almost 80,000 students.
A priest was a man who went into the system of education, which you call the mystery system, from age 7, at the time when he was circumcised and brought in. At age 47, 40 years of training, studying the 7 liberal arts, science, law, engineering, all that goes with it, and he had qualified in each of his degrees. He became known as a priest. So that means that you will spend 4 years for your bachelor's, 2 years for your master's, and another 2 or 1 depending for your doctorate. You would have just begun to study. And you're talking about a long time of study. You would have been there 40 years without ever going to see your parents or anyone else.
Why didn't we know about this? Because if you go among the Bushmen and the Kalahari, or the Woogabuga and the Lugabuga, you're not going to find mathematics. As Moors and the Arabs brought from India the numbers Fibonacci, yes, brought it to Europe first in 1202, but the Europeans didn't accept it because the church said numbers are works of the devil. manuscripts as late as the 17th century.
He said that, he became more alert and more human being. He became more, you see, Malone became a more human being. Not just human being, you became a more yourself. You achieve your destiny when you go to Kemet school. You became a human being, more human. We are a human being already, but more human being. That means more wise. And when you go to Kemet school, when Plato himself compare what they do in Kemet school, I give Greek because it will be no debate. You see, it's our school in Greece, the way we are doing things is just for creatures like pigs. You see, like pigs. You see, and he say myself, I'm ashamed. Myself as a Plato, I'm ashamed. We do things like that is a shame. And also, not only for myself, for all Greek, the Greek world is a shame. Where we came also.
Most anthropologists have been satisfied to go looking for vanishing little tribes, utterly irrelevant, the Wooga Booga and the Luga Booga. And they go and they spend 6 months a year and they study all they know about the Luga Boogas. All their little ritual and their dances and their kinship system, who is my mother's brother, sister's son, etc. Utterly irrelevant to any illuminating vision of African civilization. And they come and they extrapolate masses of things about it. And so we have thousands and thousands of books about Africa that tell us absolutely nothing about the quintessential Africa. I cannot imagine what it is to take about 100 million people, the youngest people, and rip them out of the heart and core of a continent. Because we can only heal, and this is true for the black as well as for the white, both the prisoner and the imprisoned, both the prisoner, and the jailer. We are doing this because it is necessary to revise the history of man. The tremendous anguish which is deep in the heart of all of us, which arises out of these falsehoods, the falsehoods upon which this civilization are built, have got to go.
With jet black faces once walked the earth all alone, no other races, until he traveled to the other lands colder than the motherland, and then the cross began. That's when the frost began, the pigment loss began. The further north this man traveled as he crossed new land, the man in the ice who once walked in the sand, soon he began to lose his tan.
This is a figure, a sculpture that was found
Yet on the inside,
and one of the things that they have
he was still
discovered
African.
is that many of the sculptures of early Europe show various African types. In fact, 55,000 years ago, according to 3 labs, the University of Oxford, the University of Hawaii, the University of California at Berkeley have come to the conclusion that there are no people on the earth 55,000 years ago who are not black Africans.
The Rhind Papyrus contains written problems in trigonometry dated 1650 BC. This is 600 years before Greece, which was the first European country. Remember that.
Yes. Problem number 56 in the Rhind Mathematical Papyrus, that's the one you see up there, seeks to find the slope of a pyramid whose height is 250.
Hello. It discusses the greatest structure man has ever built, the Great Pyramid. Now listen to the incredible facts, and you see this
seven
is
wonders
true.
of the world.
This is the greatest
This
thing man has
magnificent
ever
structure
built,
stands as tall as
and
a
I can prove it.
45-story building and is comprised of nearly 2.5 million stone blocks, which weigh an average of 2.5 tons each. This one building is comprised of enough stone to make 30 Empire State Buildings. Largest colonnaded hall ever constructed. This great hall consists of 136 columns, which stand in 16 rows. The tallest columns are 69 feet high and are large enough to accommodate a group of 100 men standing on its apex. This one room has enough floor space to equal the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris, and the entire complex is large enough to accommodate all of the churches built in London since the birth of Jesus the Christ.
Awesome. No wonder mama sent me to college. No wonder she said, son, remember, the power's in the knowledge. Power's in the knowledge. Join the glorious struggle to maintain and stand silent.
Galileo suggested the ancients had telescopes. He wasn't believed. Galileo used the African water clock in his experiments. Many of us like to make noise today about colored people's time. There's no such thing. That is slave time. These are the things where we start to glorify incompetence, to glorify inefficiency. The Africans were remarkable in those times because they were the best in their field. They strove for excellence. Not everyone can be excellent, but you have to strive for it. It has to be an ideal. You don't just take for granted because you've been beaten down in a society, in a culture, in a period of time, that you must aspire to the worst in that society because that is what is expected of you. What they expect of us is their bloody business. It is what we expect of ourselves.
So make no mistake, you are dealing with extraordinary people. But our people didn't play around with things. It had to be perfect. When the Japanese were building the pyramid, when they tried to put the stones in alignment, they cracked and broke and were badly scratched. When they went to check the stones that the Egyptians had put into alignment, 1/1000th of an inch accurate, not a single stone was scratched or cracked. You are dealing with people who felt you had to be as perfect as possible. Let us pray that those of us, our people who learn of their heritage, their ancestors, will not accept mediocrity as their standard.
About 7 centuries ago, they found Africans were plotting an invisible star, Sirius B. Sirius A is a bright star we all see in the night sky. Sirius B is impossible to see with the naked eye. It is impossible to see it with the naked eye. It has a magnitude of about 8.5. And the Africans not only saw it, they plotted its orbit and trajectory right up to the end of the 20th century, up to the year 1990. And the diagram produced by our best astronomy today is identical with what they produced centuries ago. We only became aware of that star towards the end of the 19th century. And not only that, they intuited its mass. This is a white dwarf. It is an imploded star. It's not only impossible to see with the naked eye, it is the most sophisticated astronomy that has shown us that a star so imploded is much heavier than stars that appear 6 times brighter and larger. They came to that conclusion. They had plotted the spiral structure of the Milky Way. They had seen the Jupiter and Saturn, the rings and the moons thereof. They had worked all of that out. But particularly Sirius B. It caused such astonishment, such consternation in astronomical circles that Kenneth Brecht of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in Cambridge, Massachusetts, he said, The Africans have no business knowing any of this. All destroyed. And yet the fragments exist, so significant that we have 10 major medical texts in African languages. The first medical texts in the world are in African language. The first mathematical papyri which you saw this morning, that's African. Those are the first. Even today, with all the destruction, we could still go back to the African documents and show them on a screen. The Ebers Papyrus, the Edwin Smith Papyrus, the Smith Papyrus, which is 1500 BC. They have chapters on helminthiasis, ophthalmology, gynecology, pregnancy diagnosis, circulation of the blood, the pulse, diagnostic percussion, all that, chapters, intestinal disease and all that 1500 years before Christ. Africans.
Architect responsible for the design of the step pyramid was a man named Imhotep. Imhotep was recorded in history as the world's first multi-genius. He is a prime minister to Zoser. He was a poet, a philosopher, a physician. He is considered to be the author of the world's oldest medical treatise ever written. It is a document that is now called the Edwin Smith Medical Papyrus. This book describes 48 different injuries to the head, to the face, to the neck, and the spinal column.
But our people didn't play around with things. It had to be perfect. And they went to check the stones that the Egyptians had put into alignment 1/1000th of an inch accurate. Not a single stone was scratched or cracked. You are dealing with people who felt you had to be as perfect as possible. Let us pray that those of us, our people who learn of their heritage, their ancestors, will not accept mediocrity as their standard.
Want to see the proof? Want to get that power? The power's in the knowledge, but it only comes to you when you know what your ancestors did, because only then do you know what you can do.
You are dealing with people who felt you had to be as perfect as possible. Let us pray that those of us, our people who learn of their heritage, their ancestors, will not accept mediocrity as their standard.
For ancient black Africans, being mediocre was never enough. Always remember the true history of African people, and you will strive to reach the excellence and perfection that those great Africans achieved. Only the power's in the knowledge. Do your best.